All right. Let's get fired up here.
Maximum freedom. Read.
Stay on target.
Maximum.
Stay on target.
Maximum freedom. Read Rothbard.
Well, hello and welcome to the actual Anarchy podcast where we talk about movies from a Rothbardian and Anarcho-capitalist perspective. And tonight we are going to be doing a long one. This one didn't quite qualify for the Boston Marathon, but it's close. It's 3 hours and 15 minutes of communist propaganda called Reds. And we have a returning guest who we haven't had on in over 100 episodes. And it will be a good one, I think. A barn burner, Robert. What do you think?
Yeah, it's very strange or coincidental or not coincidental at all. Why am I saying coincidental? It's coincidental. That our guest...
You're making up words.
Our guest has got the same name as the main character of this movie.
Yeah, and I think that it's actually a sly level of self-promotion on the part of our...
That he's a communist?
No, that he has the same name as the protagonist of the movie. And I'm sure we can
But
get...
he's not a communist.
He's pretty dang close.
Possibly a closet communist.
Closet communist. He was our guest for episode 33, way back when, talking about the Leo DiCaprio film, another almost 3-hour film called The Aviator. And that can be found at actualanarchy.com/33. This one on Reds, the 1981 Warren Beatty flick. Warren Beatty? Beatty? Can be found at actualanarchy.com/139.
Yeah, welcome, Mr. Jonathan Reed.
Why, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, you say that now, but just wait until I subject you to the Last Nighters portion of the show.
I'll give you a fair chance.
Hey everyone, it's Daniel Elwood and Robert Johnson, the Last Nighters. And the Last Nighters are part of the Launchpad Media, where we're always launching new ideas in your direction. Check it out at thelaunchpadmedia.com. The is very important in that URL, so don't forget the. So tonight we're going to be doing Reds as episode 82 of the show, and this is going to be a fun one. We have a guest. His name is Jon Reed, and he's a communications professional who's been a writer and video creator for the past 20 years. He enjoys debating current events and explaining the blessings of liberty and how to get it, as well as long walks on the beach. John's a movie buff, wine lover, and introvert who enjoys his time chilling at home or hanging out with a select few people who spike his intellect and curiosity, and cats. He's a cat person. You can go to his website at johnreedcreative.com to check out more of what he offers in the ways of his communications profession. Jon, welcome to the show. Thank you very much for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me once again. It's been too long.
Yes, indeed.
Serious NPR style intro. You don't normally do that kind of stuff, but I liked it.
I'm flattered, and I really don't deserve it, quite frankly.
Well, I'm trying to up the quality of the show because you are a professional, and I want to give the appearance that we are also professionals. It may be a little bit of a smoke and mirrors, a bit of a delusion, but we're talking about a communist movie, so why not start off?
Like communism working, smoke and mirrors.
The future works.
I've seen it. So, Jon, why don't you, I already told everyone about you, but is there anything you'd like to add before we get into the Google description and then start talking about this movie?
No, I think you said it mostly. I mean, the last time I was on here, I was doing a podcast with my friend Pat. As I was telling you before the show started, Pat moved to Wisconsin, the bastard. And we haven't done the podcast in a while. And frankly, I never wanted to do it in the first place. He kind of forced me into it. I didn't want to start really getting into politics, but he forced me into it, and it was fun for a while. But he's moved on to better and greater things. So I'm just honored to hang out with you guys and do whatever I can to promote liberty, even if it's through analyzing a movie about a pinko commie bastard like Jon Reed.
Yeah, now that will give us plenty of fodder to talk about. And so, there's basically no movie that can be chosen that we can't turn into some kind of somewhat entertaining and somewhat educational fodder for the show. So this will be just great.
Well, the reason I chose this, and there's kind of a backstory. When I was in college, I had to take an elective. I was in the honors program, not to kind of build myself up or anything like that. But I had to take an elective honors course in order to make sure I completed the honors program. So what I was doing was I went to this professor who was teaching an ancient civilizations course. And we were talking, and I got into his course, and he asked me my name, and I said, Jon Reed. And he said, oh, like the communist writer of the 20s. And I just was kind of puzzled as to what he meant. And he's like, oh, no, there's this guy named Jon Reed. He had he was in the writer in the 20s, the late teens of the 20th century. And there were a bunch of there were the Jon Reed clubs about that were comprised of these communist writers that were named after him. And I had known about the movie because, I grew up in the 80s and it had been on HBO, and I was never really interested in it because I was kind of young, and the subject matter didn't really interest me much. So later on I did watch it. And while I initially, because of the format, and you'll understand what I mean with the witnesses, the testimonies and everything like that, I was kind of not excited about it or not engaged with it at first. But the second time I watched it and the third time I watched it, it eventually became like a favorite movie of mine. And I think that the reason libertarians should watch this movie, and correct me if you disagree, but I think there are a lot of things about communism and about socialism that libertarians will appreciate, especially the way later on in the movie that it kind of falls apart. Like the dream of communism, the dream of the utopian socialist society is not realized the way Jon Reed appreciates it later on in the film. It becomes more totalitarianism, it becomes more authoritarian, and even though he sticks with it out of sheer pride, it's clear that it's not working out the way he initially thought it would.
Yeah, and it's Emma Goldman who ultimately tries to convince him that he's wrong about that. But I think the movie mostly shows the futility and the overall mess that is the political process. Jack spends almost the entire film arguing with other communists and other socialists about who should lead this party and which party should actually be represented, and is the officially recognized party of Moscow. And he ends up, I don't know, it seems like he spends a whole lot of time spinning his wheels and not actually convincing hardly anybody of his political ideas. But
it seems like a fool's errand.
Yeah. Daniel, you want to get into the Google description, buddy?
I do. I already have so much I want to say, but
okay,
let's do the Google description. We'll get there.
All right.
We got all night, right? Right, everyone? Oh, and by the way, dear listeners, if you like what we do here, do give us a subscribe on the old Apple Podcasts or YouTube. Give us a rating and review. And our guest, Jon Reed, not the commie, but the not commie, did mention we have some pre-show content. We will also have some post-show content, which are available both for our Patreon supporters. So check it out at lastnighters.com/Patreon to get a hold of that. So without further ado, let's get into the Google description, how we usually kick these things off. So we are talking tonight about Reds, and it is a 1981 drama/romance, 3 hours and 20 minutes, according to YouTube or Google. They're the same thing, whatever. 7.4 on the IMDb, 3.5 out of 4 on RogerEbert.com, 92% Rotten Tomatoes. However, only 79% of Google users like it. So that's a bit of disparity there.
Yeah, and I don't understand that because I was a film student, and from a film perspective, it is really a great film. Even if you don't agree with the subject matter from a libertarian standpoint, or if you hate commies, I think it really is a good film. I think it's well acted. I think it's well shot. I think the dialogue is really good. So I don't really get the subpar ratings on it, but I think it's a good film. And again, even though you don't like the subject matter possibly, but I think it's well acted and I think it's well made.
Okay, John. Well, you and I will disagree a little bit on that. I think we'll get into it and maybe we can come to some kind of agreement. But Daniel, you go ahead, buddy.
All right. So here is the description. American journalist Jon Reed, played by Warren Beatty, journeys to Russia to document the Bolshevik Revolution and returns a revolutionary. His fervor for left-wing politics leads him to Louise Bryant, played by Diane Keaton, who at the time was married, and who will become a feminist icon and activist. Politics at home become more complicated as the rift grows between reality and Reed's ideals. Bryant takes up with a cynical playwright, played by Jack Nicholson, and Reed returns to Russia where his health declines. This came out on Christmas 1981. The director was Warren Beatty. The star was Warren Beatty. The producer was Warren Beatty. And he won a Best Director Oscar Academy Award for this film. and I think they made about $40 million in the box office, and the budget was pretty close to that. So that is our description. And my one comment to you, Jon Reed, the not communist Jon Reed, is regarding the ratings that are on here. The 92% Rotten Tomatoes, those are the critics. Mm-hmm. And so that's pretty high. It probably got like high marks for its craft and how well it's made. But the Google users is like the yous and the me's going out there and reading this description and clicking this plus or minus on whether we like it or not. And I can see why an audience, just a Joe audience, might be like, oh, that's a super long, kind of boring movie. So not as well acclaimed from the masses.
I think it's a challenge because it's like you said, it's a very long movie. It's like 3 hours and 20 minutes. And I don't know if the version you had the intermission kind of slide on it, but it's kind of quaint in that it's so long. Back in the day, it had an intermission where people in the theater could get up and get a snack or a drink or go to the bathroom during the intermission. It was probably like 15 minutes, but that's how long it is. Although it's not unusual for movies to be that long now. I mean, like the Avengers, Infinity Wars, or whatever are pretty lengthy movies, but they're entertaining. And this is this is not an action-packed movie. It's a very slow-moving movie from a dramatic standpoint. So I'm not surprised that your average audience, as opposed to your kind of elitist, journalistic film critic point of view, I think they will like it a lot more than the average Joe. I think that, so I don't think that's surprising at all.
Yeah, we're so bougie, us film critics here.
Yes.
Now, speaking of the intermission, the irony of that is my wife and I, we get like snippets of time where we can actually watch shows and movies. And so we actually had to space this out over 2 days. We made it about 2 hours into it and then shut it down Wednesday night. And then we finished it last night. And about 5 minutes into starting up where we left off, the intermission starts. Or
yes.
Like, oh crap, we could have made it to the intermission, even though we didn't know it was there. And in reading on this, I guess this was one of the last films to actually have an intermission. Has been one since. But yeah, it is kind of a quaint, kind of old-timey thing. But you're right, a lot of newer movies are getting really, really long. And I think they're more action-packed and more entertaining, so it kind of just goes by a little quicker. I have actually had not seen any of the most recent Avengers movies, Endgame or Infinity War. So, Robert, maybe you can spill some color on this. Not red, but just how movies have gone into greater length and people are more willing to sit through them.
Yeah, I don't know if necessarily that people are more willing to sit through long movies. I definitely say that a movie like this has more confidence in its story than, say, like an Infinity War. Like they're confident in their story, but I don't know if they're confident enough to put an intermission in between to break up the action and the drama. Whereas this movie is like, well, we'll just slap one here in the middle and you'll come back, right? You'll come back and watch the second half. Come on, guys. Even though my big problem with this movie was that what's the big narrative push? Where's the weight? What's the central conflict? It seems to be about these two characters and their on and off again romance and set it against this backdrop of World War I and the Russian Revolution. But it's just kind of like this slice of life telling their story of life, right? It's not necessarily that. I mean, there is one instance where Diane Keaton is trying to get to Russia while Jack is actually imprisoned in Finland. And, there's some drama there. Are they going to get together? Are they not? And this sort of thing. But I found a lot of the actual story weight to be kind of meandering and arbitrary as to what they were showing and what they weren't showing. I don't know. Like the love triangle with the Jack Nicholson character never really amounted to anything. The Jack ended up dying in this Russian hospital and nothing was ever actually concluded. Like there was no actual central theme that, really came home for me. So I don't know what my original point was, but I just started talking. Sorry.
I think that's apropos because I think your point is that there wasn't a lot of point to the movie.
Thank you.
Which I kind of agree. Like in watching this, I kept waiting for something in the form of a story arc to happen. Because in reading about it, Warren Beatty this has been a pet project of his for years, for like a decade and a half before it got made. He recorded something like 3 million feet of film, which is the equivalent of 2 weeks worth of footage.
Wow.
And he was like an obsessive compulsive type person in making this film. He would do multiple takes, like dozens of takes. And in one instance, Gene Hackman, who was in the film as a favor to a friend, not even paid, he did 100 takes. And he said, "What the fuck do you want, Warren? I'm not doing 101st take." And he didn't. So they used one of the 100. And it was so bad, apparently, that I guess Gene Hackman had been offered a role in Dick Tracy, like almost 10 years later. Warren Beatty was, of course, the star and the director of that. And Gene turned him down. He's like, "No, I'm not going to do that again."
Fool me once. Shame on me.
And also, just a little bit more color to this. Apparently, Diane Keaton and Warren Beatty were an item at the time.
Well, Warren Beatty was an item with almost every actress in Hollywood during that time, so that's not surprising.
But apparently, due to the rigors of the production and all that, their relationship broke down because of his insistence on the number of takes and the perfectionism. And I mean, I can't tell my wife much of anything critical without it becoming an issue. So I can only imagine what it would be like being the director on a film with your girlfriend or whatever. But anyway,
yeah.
A little bit of a diversion there, but yeah, Robert, I will agree. I didn't really get what the story was until towards the end, where they're like in the midst of the revolution, and you kind of see the idealism that he has. And I will say that he's right in the way, like we talked about a couple of episodes ago, where Bernie Sanders and AOC are right about something's wrong, but then their solution is something that's going to make it worse. And I saw a lot of that in the Jon Reed character here.
Me too. All the characters seem to be pointing to things that, I mean, they go a little bit overboard a lot of times when they talk about, I'd have to look at it, my notes, but they do a good job, well, okay, so I'll say this. They get it wrong when they say that the capitalists are all exploiting the workers and that sort of thing. They don't understand economics in that sense. But they're absolutely right when they're talking about, like Jack says in the very beginning, that World War I is about profits.
Right.
And, JP Morgan loaned England $1 billion, so the U.S. entered the war on their behalf to be able to collect the debt and that sort of thing. I'm not exactly 100% sure on that history being correct, but it sounds like it would be a thing. It sounds legitimate to me.
Yeah, that's like the Smedley Butler, his book War is a Racket, which we can post in the show notes page, but he's basically outlining that book just in his little speech there. But go ahead, John.
But this is one of the things I think libertarians should appreciate in this story. When he says profits, that might be true, but who is guaranteeing the profits for whoever, like the corporations, or there wasn't really a military industrial complex at this point. But if he's worried about corporations or companies making profits, then who's enforcing that? I mean, companies can't legally go to war. No company, no corporation is going to go to war with Germany or whoever. So who's guaranteeing that they are going to be sitting pretty at the end of the war with whatever industry they're going to supply with whatever's left after Germany's defeated or whatever. So I think while his analysis of profits is why the war is being fought isn't necessarily wrong, it's like Robert said, what's the solution after that? Is that it's not greater government that the socialists want, the progressives want. It's less government. And you gotta appreciate at the same time that this is all going on, Mises is writing his best works, Socialism and Human Action or whatever. I'm not exactly sure of the timeline, but he's writing. Mises is active during this time. He's trying to write to kind of temper what's going on, the growing the rise of socialism. But I'm sure Jack Reed isn't even aware of Mises at this point. So his analysis of what the problem actually is completely backward.
Yeah, it really seemed that this little insular group of artists and playwrights and political activists in Greenwich Village were really kind of living in this bubble of thought. And then, they talk about reading Marx and Engels and that sort of thing, but it didn't seem like you had a whole lot of external ideas coming in like a Ludwig von Mises.
Right.
And let me say, the libertarian nerd in me was geeking out in this movie about all the communism and all the economic fallacies and all that sort of stuff. But I wonder how it probably speaks to the average reviews from the normal viewers that all that would be lost and then they're left with just this long meandering movie. But anyway, Daniel, I know you got something to say.
Oh, man, like a million things, but I can't express myself monosyllabically enough for you to understand any of it. So back to the profits thing. I know I'm going to harp on this a little bit. the profits that he's denouncing and we're denouncing are the cronyist profits from the government buying products from the companies that make war machines.
Yep.
So but I'm sure Jon Reed, the commie in the movie, is saying profits in general are bad, when there's a distinction to be made between corporate crony profits and profits for satisfying the wants and desires of your fellow man in a voluntary way. And those are two very different things. And profit is a very important signal to tell you whether you're allocating resources appropriately or not. And it's one of the cruxes of economic calculation, which is one of Mises's big critiques of socialism. And that book came out in 1920. And Emma Goldman almost comes to this realization by the end of the film, when she says this kind of system that the Bolsheviks have put together as a top-down central planning system that can't work. It doesn't work, and it can't work. Now, she's looking at it not in the, you don't have a way to economically calculate, but she's looking at it more in the way that you can't have one small group of people having all the power dictating out to the masses and expect a good result. And she was actually highlighting how, there's nothing on the store shelves, there's the trains aren't running on time, the buses aren't running on time. All of these problems are because there was such a centralized control on every aspect of life. And in fact, Jon Reed, when he gets to Russia the second time, I think, and he says, I need to leave. I need to go back. And my wife, she needs to hear from me because we had some issues right as I was leaving. I said to be back by Christmas. And the Russian dude was like, no, you're part of this now. You can't leave. And that was like one of those gotcha bitch moments where it's like, all right, that's what you wanted. You wanted socialism. Well, here it is. Yep. You can't be an individual anymore.
Which is really weird why his character doesn't have a complete arc. He dies like this true believer. Like, I guess it's the cognitive dissonance that he has to keep believing in this because he's invested so much in these ideas. But you would think that when he comes to Russia for the second time and he quits that one council because he's just like, I'm fed up with you guys. You guys won't listen to me and blah, blah, blah. You'd think he'd come around, but no, he dies a true believer, which it makes me wonder why this movie has him as the central character.
Yeah, well, I don't know how you want to go through the movie. I mean, I think that the first third of the movie, I think if we want to set the table for libertarians who might be interested in watching this movie, I think we should let them know that the first third of the movie is kind of like establishing Jon Reed and Louise Bryant as characters and who they were during this time and their kind of tumultuous relationship and the kind of work that they did. Louise Bryant tried to make it as a writer. Jon Reed was already an established writer. Emma Goldman is introduced. Max Eastman is introduced. These are very principled people, even though if you don't agree with their principles. And this is kind of what this part of the movie is kind of interesting to me because as much as I hate communism, I hate socialism, I will say that the people who represent the communist movement, the socialist movement at this time, at least they were kind of principled and they understood that once the revolution happened in their world, in their minds, that people were going to have to work, the workers were going to have to contribute to society, as a kind of contradiction to today's communism where everybody wants to paint murals, everybody wants to live off the production of the rich people and get free healthcare, get free college education, whatever.
Or paint over murals, right, Robert?
Yes.
There is like a paradox where, like, if you look at the Russian propaganda at that time, it was kind of like posters of men and women rolling their sleeves up and getting work done and things like that. Whereas now you're all about feelings and identity politics and making sure that pansexual, non-binary people are allowed to express themselves to the greatest extent that they can. There was something to admire about the comic. They really thought it would work in the sense that everybody was going to collectively work and have the right work ethic toward making society work. So it is interesting to see this dynamic played out in this movie, which is one of the things, especially Emma Goldman. I think she was very principled. Max Eastman was very principled, and they wanted to see a collective society work. And as you said, eventually Emma Goldman comes to the point where she realizes this isn't what we signed up for.
Yeah. Now
Right.
I would agree to a point, but even these principled people lack principles.
Yes,
So many,
obviously, yeah.
and they're significantly contradictory. Like It opens with Jon Reed, or at least the witnesses, and these are actual people who knew the real people. Yep. One of the guys said, "Oh yeah, Jon Reed. Yeah, he wanted to make $1 million by the time he was 25." That's not a very commie thing, right?
Right.
And then,
it's very Bernie though.
well,
Although he had to wait until he was like 75 to do it.
Yeah, and now he's running again for a fourth house, I think. And it's a funny thing. He got in trouble for not paying a $15 wage. So he had to cut out.
He cut hours.
And now he's getting sued over it. It's hilarious. But anyway, what was the other thing that was contradictory? Oh, they had a sign in their apartment in Greenwich Village that said "Property is theft. Come in." And then later on, when she's complaining about all the people being there all hours or whatever,
right.
He's like to her, "Oh yeah, just kick him out." Well, hold on now. You just said property is theft, and now you're trying to control this space.
Right.
Yeah, that stuck out to me too. That was really quite amusing. I wrote that in my notes. But what a time! I mean, this is an interesting time for them to pick out to talk about socialism, because this is the giant upheaval. It must have been very, very exciting for these people who believed in these ideas to have the Russian Revolution occur. Like, imagine if Russia went ANCAP tomorrow. It'd be super exciting.
Wait a minute, they haven't, because I keep getting told I'm a Russian bot. And by the way, just so there's a little bit of background, the Russian Revolution was actually two revolutions, right? There was one in the spring, the Kerensky government, and then the Bolsheviks took over a weakened, disarrayed state. And Tom Woods has a really good episode on this. I think it's episode 399 of his show. So tomwoods.com/399. You can get the background on both the Kerensky and the Bolshevik Revolution, and then the horrors since. And I'll also have some links on the show notes page, which can be found at lastnighters.com/82. Anyway, I digress.
Digress, sir.
Well, someone had a head of steam, and now I blew it.
Well, one thing I will point out, that one of the earlier scenes, when they're sitting around the restaurant and just talking about, politics and everything, like one of the things Emma Goldman says is that the capitalists can take us into war whenever they want. And also she remarks that voting is the opium of the masses, and every election voters simply deaden their pain, which I thought was very insightful. And if you Wikipedia Emma Goldman, she is an anarchist. She's not a communist in the sense that she believes in authoritarianism. We have to understand what communism was in the Marxian sense. Marx believed that communism was the natural evolution after capitalism. He thought that eventually there had to be an authoritarian state, but it was only necessary so that it could dissolve itself later on, and the workers could eventually take over and run the economy themselves. So that's, I think, where Emma Goldman was coming from, and this is what led to her disillusionment later when she realized that the Soviet Union was nothing but an authoritarian regime and not the kind of workers' revolution, the workers' run system that she thought it was going to be.
Yeah, for sure. Now, Emma Goldman's got all kinds of interesting quotes. I don't think she's perfect, but I think she has her heart in the right place. I think she could have benefited from maybe reading some Mises, but here's a quote. "We Americans claim to be a peace-loving people. We hate bloodshed. We are opposed to violence. Yet we go into spasms of joy over the possibility of projecting dynamite bombs from flying machines upon helpless citizens." It's from a speech in 1908.
That's kind of prophetic.
That's a great quote. And it reminds me of the scene where they're grilling Bryant at Congress or whatever. And she's like retorting back to the guy. Like, they're like, "Are you a God-fearing Christian?" And she's like, "Well, I was raised baptized." And she totally turned it around on him and made it so, well, you're saying so this God-fearing nation is the one going out and projecting violence out into the world. I forget the exact quote, but that's kind of the gist of it. Like, he was trying to make her out to be the bad guy, but she flipped it right on him. And it was brilliant.
Right. She's like, if this is Christianity, I'll take atheism anytime.
And during that testimony, she also notes that in the USSR, the women have the right to vote, which is kind of interesting because they have the right to vote, but what are they voting for? It's not like they're voting for, optimal expression of the individual. They're voting for their own oppression, much like Americans do, even though they aren't quite as oppressed as people in the Soviet Union were. But she made that as like a real selling point of communism or Bolshevism, where the thing you're voting for isn't really appealing, even though you have the right to vote.
Right. Yeah. And then that was also during the time when it was right after the revolution, when all the platitudes were still in place, and everyone was like still excited about it. And so voting was still kind of a thing. And it was before the authoritarianism really took over. Because that was a few years later that they showed where Emma Goldman was like, "Hey, they're rounding people up. I might be next,"
Right.
And
right.
so
And the communists
cleansing of
outlawed the
people-
church.
Right, and the cleansing of people who are doing wrongthink hadn't
Right.
started yet.
Yeah, and if the one character, who was an actual person that Jack encounters, who was I want to get his name right, but it was Grigory Zinoviev, who's kind of like he reminds me of Trotsky in the sense, like, he's got the big bushy hair, but he's like also he makes an impassioned case for Jon Reed to stay and work for the Department of Propaganda. He's very impassioned about what he's doing, and it's kind of like, if you read about him on Wikipedia, just his Wikipedia page, it illustrates the tumultuous evolution of the Soviet Union, because he was very on board with Lenin, and then when Lenin died, he had to kind of get into Stalin's good graces, and that didn't last very long, and Stalin eventually threw him in prison, and then he got out, but his role in the communist government was very much diminished. So even though he's very impassioned in pleading his case why Jon Reed should stay, eventually, if you read what happens to Zinoviev later on, it doesn't really work out well for him. I mean, the communist utopia that even he envisions, even more so committed than Jon Reed is, it just can't work. I mean, going back to Emma Goldman, it's like, this is a system that cannot work, because what we're in the end talking about is not a collective system where every individual is on board and making the economy work. They're really, what it ultimately boils down to is a few elite people concentrating power on their own and just dictating what happens to the masses, for good or for bad.
Right, and they can't possibly know all the downstream effects that are going to happen from their fatal conceit, right? They only know so much, and that top-down control, it never works, because it can't work, because there's no feedback. There's no way of knowing whether you're allocating resources effectively or not, and anyone who dissents must be dealt with.
Right.
And it's not going to be a conversation.
Yeah. It's not like the people, the farmers who were growing grain or growing whatever crops they were growing in the Soviet Union were going to work as they always had and contribute to the collective society, selling grain or selling whatever products they had for whatever price they needed, even if it was like a set price by the government. No, the government wanted that food in the cities. They took whatever the farmers had in the countryside and they moved it to the cities, because that's where all the people were concentrated, and that's why there was such mass starvation in the Soviet Union, especially under Stalin. And it's kind of like you said, the fatal conceit, going back to Hayek, in that even though how much you want it to work, your best laid plans are always gonna fall short, because you can't understand what the needs of the people are or how to best allocate resources, because you're not getting that profit and loss signal from the market.
Right, and even in the film, they mentioned the 4 million people who died of starvation, and Jon Reed's response to this is near the end, when he's chatting with Emma Goldman about their ideals and how sometimes you do need to smash a few eggs, comrade.
Right, exactly.
To make the cookies. And he's almost making that authoritarian argument or absolving them of all the violence and the evil downstream effects that, even unintended, were preventable.
Yeah.
Anyway, go ahead, Robert. Sorry.
No, I was just going to mention that, to your point about the famines, where especially Stalin came in and just kept just robbing all the farmers of the grain, led to what is known as the Holodomor, if anybody knows. It was in 1932 and 33, and it's estimated to have killed between 3.3 to 7.5 million.
Yeah, and there was a great Mises University was last week in Auburn, Alabama, and Tom DiLorenzo gave a great talk, like 10 things millennials should know about socialism. So there's a YouTube video about that, and he actually gets into the death toll from socialism attempting to be implemented, among other things. And so I'll post that on our show notes page, because it's excellent. It's a very, very good speech. I posted it on Facebook, and it got shared around a fair amount. And it's really good. So
yeah, there are photographs of the Holodomor of people selling human meat, which is great. It's always a good sign. And they're mostly children didn't make it through the Holodomor because small and didn't run very fast. You could catch them and eat them. It's beautiful. It's like,
well, I googled this online. I couldn't find actually any images, but I know Jordan Peterson in many of his talks about the posters, the propaganda posters that the Soviet government put out, reminding parents that it was wrong to eat their children. So that's how bad it was. You had to have propaganda posters reminding people that eating their children was a bad thing to do.
I mean, usually it's a thing that you would know, but
Yeah, and you say what you will about capitalism, but I don't remember ever Walmart putting on a poster saying, "Oh, by the way, don't eat your kids."
Yeah, and I'm used to propaganda being like telling you something that is actually incorrect, but in this case, I support this message.
Right.
But it absolves them of their own blame. They're like, look at all these people eating their kids. We have to tell them not to do this. Right. It's not because they've robbed them of all their food.
Right, yeah. We'll just have
another resources.
Another propaganda campaign, just like we need another regulation and another law, and then all of a sudden the bad things won't happen anymore.
Just make it illegal to eat your kids. I don't understand. What's the problem?
Well, it's another economic consequence that the government itself doesn't recognize. Like, oh, well, college tuition is so expensive, that can't be anybody else's fault but the greedy colleges and the universities, and we can't straddle they never have an introspective kind of perspective in the sense that, like, oh, well, maybe we should get out of the student loan business, and maybe
every intervention begets an additional intervention. And back to your point, Robert, I think we just need some common sense kid eating control, and then it'll be totally fine. It's just we're one law away from the utopian solution here.
Right, if your child is born with a defect, if your child is born with a defect like Down syndrome, okay, then we'll grant you that you could probably eat it. But if you have a healthy, normal kid, then it's probably wrong.
All right, we're being facetious, everyone. Don't flag us for hate speech or whatever.
This is going to prevent me from getting my next job. I know it.
All right. So you brought up Jordan Peterson. And so I actually had a point in the first portion of the film. In the witnesses' interviews, they're talking about Jon Reed being a man of principles, an independent and a fighting man. But he's a man who wants to change the world, but he either has no problems or he refuses to face them. Mm-hmm. And I think that highlights this guy very well. And it goes to a big Jordan Peterson point where, hey, if you're going to go out and try to fix the world, clean your room first. Make sure that your house is in order. Because if you can't even manage your own life, how can you ever hope to manage the lives of millions of other people?
Right.
It also speaks to a point we've made many, many times on this show, in that clearly Jon Reed had all his other needs met, that he was able to go out and rabble-rouse and complain about everything, about the workers and whatnots, because he's not busy digging a ditch. He had enough wealth. He came from a fairly wealthy family.
Right. And I think that's the point. I think that's indicative of the modern intellectual progressive movement, in the sense that who is being the loudest voice for the downtrodden? It's the rich, intellectual, progressive people who come from very well-to-do homes. And Jon Reed and Louise Bryant are no exception. I mean, they come from very well-to-do homes. And one of my favorite parts of the movie is the confrontation that Louise Bryant has with Eugene O'Neill when she goes to his apartment in Manhattan, and he kind of lays it out to her like, he's very skeptical of what she's laying down, in the sense that she and Jack don't understand the American worker. And he says it very, I think, poetically, in the sense that he says that the dream of the American worker is to work hard enough so that they're rich enough never have to work again. It's not like they're really aching to get into this collectivist thing where they have to work even harder to make society work. They're trying to live the American dream. And yet people like Louise Bryant and people like Jon Reed are setting these expectations for them that they will want to be part of this workers' revolution and be part of this, making this socialist society work, when that's not what they want at all. They just want better pay. They want more leisure time. They want better benefits. And it's just something that they don't really recognize. I mean, Jon Reed makes that impassioned speech to the Russian people at one point in the movie, saying that the workers will not be disappointed if you strike. They'll be behind you, and once you strike and once you are part of the revolution, they'll join the revolution and they'll rise up against the capitalists. No, that's not what they want at all. They just want higher pay and shorter hours and more benefits and better working conditions. That's all they want. They don't want this socialist society where they're no better off than the guy that they're working next to, who might not be working as hard as they are.
All right, so that's excellent. And I actually have an ironical point related to that. When they were shooting that scene of that particular speech, the crew who was listening to the speech went on strike. And they were like, we're being exploited. We're not going to record we're not going to film anymore until we renegotiate our payment here. And so they increased their wage each each person by $20 a day as a result. So they claimed exploitation against Warren Beatty, and he caved, and I guess he no longer exploited them.
So Warren Beatty was the Bernie Sanders of his time, I guess.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, a little better looking. I think he's a dashing man.
He's a very handsome guy.
Well, speaking of rich young progressives speaking up for the downtrodden and fighting for the rights of the oppressed, this movie did take place 100 years ago, essentially. And this really is just history repeating itself. Is it just going to keep going like this? Or have we learned nothing?
It feels like the American worker or the American bourgeoisie. What does Doug Casey call them? The bourgeoisie? So not the workers per se. Well, the boobs, like the Americana, booba something. I don't know. Boobiness, like the dummies. They don't want to work. So they would find this Jon Reed and Bryant talk very appealing, right? You don't have to work anymore. You're going to get your needs taken care of. This goes back to what you were talking about earlier, John, where the modern day AOC type progressives, they don't want to work. They just want a lot of free shit. They want the credit for being compassionate with other people's money,
right? While
living in luxury. It's amazing.
Yeah, and it's amazing. Like the early on, again, going back to early on in the film, when you see the lifestyle that Jon Reed and Louise Bryant and all their friends and cohorts are living. They're living out in New England. They're living out in the really nice beach house and everything. That dream, that kind of lifestyle that they're living, I doubt it's very possible unless they're working in some high up, the high position in the government is not really achievable in the socialist society. And the only way you're going to get that is by working hard in a capitalist society. And it's very easy for them to preach the virtues of the worker collective and the worker revolution from where they are. But if they ever had to live in that society where it was really established and the collective was all working for the greater good of society, they wouldn't be living by that standard. I mean, they wouldn't enjoy all the luxuries that they were currently enjoying in America, while railing against the very system that they were living under and benefiting from. I mean, again, we're not saying that cronyism wasn't happening even way back then. We're just saying that the problems that they were identifying in society were not the cause of capitalism, but they were the cause of cronyism and the ever expanding government power granting the benefits of the rich and powerful.
Right, exactly. And the great economic question is compared to what? And if you were to offer me, hey, the corporatist cronyist structure we have now, or top-down totalitarian communism, socialism, I'll take cronyism every day of the week. Now, I'm not saying I advocate for it and that I like it and I enjoy it, but at least there's some cracks with which you can have some freedom, right?
Right.
When it's this top-down totalitarianism, you don't have that. I mean, well, there's the elite who are what do you call them? The what's the name? The apparatchiks. And Robert, we're going to do Chernobyl, I think, in a couple of weeks here.
Yes,
it plays up real big. We see this situation in Reds fast forwarded like 50 years. In Chernobyl. What the fuck was I talking about? My point. Anyway, yeah.
You were just blah blah blah.
That's what I do here. But yeah, so yeah, Reed and Bryant, they're not going to think of themselves of having to live subjected to what they're trying to impose on others. They think they're going to be one of the apparatchiks, one of the the high level people who's going to be like instituting this change, right? And what's the old saying? You scratch a progressive and you'll find a tyrant. That's exactly what these people do.
Yep.
Yeah, because within the heart of every revolutionary beats, what is it?
The heart of the lion?
Within the chest of every revolutionary beats the heart of a dictator, or whatever it is. I don't know.
Well, I think it's indicative of the progressive mindset in that if only they were in power, then the ideas that they stand for, put into practice, would ultimately benefit the working man, and the lowest class people of society would recognize how beneficial that their ideas are, and they would eventually come around, which I think is ultimately the dream of collectivism. Is like, once you see how beneficial all these great socialist programs are, you're going to get on board eventually, because it's just so beneficial that you'd have to be an absolute retarded rube to not see it. And the fact that the most recent election, 2016 election, that so many people voted for Trump. I mean, this is the progressive mindset. They can't get their minds around the fact that anybody would vote for Trump. I mean, 8 years under Obama, they thought, oh my God, we're actually moving toward a progressive society and it's only going to get better from here. And then Trump gets elected and the people on the coast, the elites on the coast just can't get their minds around the fact that people in middle America think differently from them. And I think it's indicative of what we're seeing in the movie Reds, is that Louise Bryant and Jon Reed just don't understand the American worker in the sense that, like Eugene O'Neill spells out again in this scene, that's my absolute favorite part of the movie, is that these people just want to work to the point where they don't have to work anymore. And they're not interested in everybody having equality in the sense that they're all equally poor. They want the most benefits for the least amount of work for themselves, and they don't want some totalitarian regime dictating what that means as far as like the kind of productivity they have to put forth.
Right. And then just to expand on your point and bring back Jordan Peterson a little bit, he makes the point that whenever he hears real communism has never been tried or real socialism has never been tried, his retort is, so you think that your one particular strand of, if you were in charge, you would be the one to make it work? Well, There's somebody standing in the shadows right behind you waiting to take that power from you because it's there for the taking, right? It's one ring and it ought to be destroyed. But since it's there for the taking and people being people, and greedy people wanting to be corrupted in, Lord Acton style, take that power and be corrupted by that power, you're not going to live very long. And so your specific brand of socialism is not going to get implemented. And then the next person's is going to be the solution, but it's not going to get implemented either. And it all goes back to the Misesian insight in 1920 that it can't work anyway. And so,
well, isn't this why Marx said that communism in the beginning is not going to be very pretty, it's going to be nasty, but eventually when we get the new socialist man, then it'll all work out.
Yeah, when we're all brainwashed automatons, it'll be great.
Right.
So he's just thinking that he's going to change humanity. This is progressive idea that we're working towards this new socialist man. It really seems to be this progressive ideology that it's ever going to happen. And they're living in these bubbles where they all agree with each other. And like you guys were saying earlier, they can't wrap their heads around that anybody would think differently.
Right, yeah, and that's a Rousseauian thing too, where he thinks that you have to mold people to bend to the general will. So individuality is out. People who have wrongthink are going to be expunged from society. And, and back to your point, Jon Reed, the non-communist, the elites on the coast voting for Hillary, they couldn't imagine anyone else thinking differently than them, and they don't attribute any critical thought to the other side of the argument. They aren't even aware of it. They just attribute it to being racist, homophobic, and evil intent, hating people, hating themselves, being too dumb. I remember being a left-leaning progressive type growing up and thinking, oh, those rubes, those conservatives, they're just trying to enforce their religion on me. They just don't understand. They're just dumb. And now I understand it's kind of the opposite. Like the elitist mindset is, oh, I already know everything, even though I've been indoctrinated in a public or government schooling system that is force feeding me propaganda, telling me that the solution to everything is more government.
And it's your duty as a progressive to correct the mindset of these people who just don't get it. And if that takes, cracking skulls, they're absolutely fine with doing that. But they are going to shape society in the way that they feel best. And it's going to be through violence. And even though they theoretically are against violence, theoretically they think that once they implement these programs, once everybody sees the benefit of everybody collectively working for the greater good, everybody's just going to get on board and they're just going to ignore their human instinct of self-interest. I don't know how they square that circle, but that's their mindset. And this, unfortunately, the only way that they're ever going to do this, which I think is the ultimate paradox of anarcho-communism, is that you're never going to get people to get on board with putting their self-interest aside in order for the greater good. Maybe for a little while you are, maybe in some aspects of society you are, but ultimately people are going to look out for their own interests and to better their own situation. So ultimately, as Emma Goldman realizes in the end, although I think for the wrong reasons that you're talking about a system that cannot possibly work and can only end up bad.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I'm using this movie as my soapbox. I'm hardly talking about the movie, but I'm just ranting.
But I think it's so long that I think that we have to dissect the different ideas that are in the movie rather than go step by step. Again, because it's like 3 hours and 20 minutes.
Right.
Well, yeah, like you were saying, I mean, a guy like Jack, I would assume would be like one of these modern day Antifa types, very extreme political people. And since they claim to align themselves with the anti-fascist, they say that any ideas that aren't ours, any ideas that we disagree with, are so dangerous that they essentially constitute violence. Because when carried out, those ideas always lead to the worst outcomes. So we are justified by hook or by crook, usually by violence, to deal with those ideas, even though, of course, the solution to bad ideas is more ideas. It doesn't make sense to beat up a guy who you disagree with. It doesn't change that person's mind. It doesn't frighten away other people, especially when you're some 20-year-old sandal-clad Berkeley person. Anyway, I don't know, non-binary thing.
Non-binary, pansexual.
I mean, you're not scaring anybody away. Anybody could actually defend themselves.
But, like I was saying, they're all indoctrinated and believe that more government is the solution, but they don't seem to realize the government has led to the deaths directly of over 420 million people in the 20th century alone, 123 million through war, which World War I is a backdrop to this film, and 262 million killed at the hands of their own government, citizens killed at the hands of their own government.
Well, in the very beginning, when they first go to Russia, bringing it back to the movie a little bit, when Jack first goes to Russia, he gets there off this train, and he's getting driven around the city, and isn't that the scene where he sees the bread lines?
Yes. Yep. And the one guy that they're in the car with says, do we have to overthrow the Tsar so we can stand in line for bread?
Yeah, so you think that would give Jack like a clue, like,
yeah,
this isn't going so well. Like, what are we doing here? This is going from bad to worse.
Yeah, and we're not apologizing for the Tsar. Things weren't great under the Tsar. In fact, right. I believe Russia was like a third world level country relative to the other countries at the time.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like it was a great situation. It was a agrarian peasant society that was going on. And so, yeah, I mean, people weren't progressing as quickly as the West.
And a lot of people have to realize like what Russia was before then. It was a very feudal system. The Tsar was always in charge, and there was always like a very monarchical, I don't know if that's the right word, system, in the sense that like there were always peasants, and then there were the ruling class. So they never had like a real industrial base from which to work once the Bolshevik Revolution happened. In fact, they actually had to invite industrialists from America to come over and teach them how to run factories. So it wasn't like that they had any kind of foundation to work from, that they could just, the Tsar was in charge of all this stuff, and the capitalists were in charge of all this stuff. So now we're just going to take it over, and now it'll be run by the people. No, it was very much so like, okay, well, now we have the Bolshevik Revolution. What do we do now? Like, how do we make cars? How do we make equipment? How do we make anything? Let's bring in people who already know how to do it so that they can teach us. So it's a very interesting system in the sense that this was the first real communist experiment that had no industrial base from which to start. So it's not like America, which had already been through the Industrial Revolution, suddenly had a workers' revolution, and now we're all communists, and the workers just took over the factories. It was a very much, this country did not have a tradition of entrepreneurship. It didn't have a tradition of industrialization. It just had a tradition of oppression from the top down. And that didn't change any from when the Bolsheviks took over. And that was the disillusionment that happened with Emma Goldman. It's like she thought that eventually the state would dissolve itself, which is ultimately the dream of Marxism. But of course, that just didn't happen. It just couldn't happen in any kind of scenario, in any real world scenario.
Right. Imagine people advocate for that. Say that human nature is such that you can't trust capitalism. Well, what do you expect is going to happen when you have people in control of the state with absolute power? You think they're going to give that up?
Yeah.
Anyway, go ahead, Robert.
Imagine the hubris it would take to be one of these revolutionaries where you're like, we're going to take over this government and then we're going to run everything. We know how to best run the automobile industry and farming and technology and communications and the mail.
And the nuclear industry.
Just blows my mind.
Isn't that what we have now with like all these the candidates, the presidential candidates, going back to 2016, whether it was Republicans or now the Democrats, how they have a plan for everything, that the hubris in the sense that they have the solution for healthcare, for college, for whatever. I mean, like the Elizabeth Warren's big thing is that she's going to save capitalism. What does that mean? Like, how do you know how to save capitalism? Like, what do you know about capitalism in the pure sense? Like, you faked your Native American heritage in order to get like a pristine position in Harvard University. Like, what is your experience with starting a business and growing a business and going through the failures and the trials and tribulation it takes to make a business successful? Your whole life has been exploiting other people or getting positions of power in order to better your own position. So what do you know about serving other people and providing value for other people?
Yeah, she's got a plan, John.
She's got a plan.
Yeah, they must think of themselves as like superheroes. Like, I've got a plan. I'm going to go out and save the world. It's madness.
All right, so we're bumping up against time already, unfortunately. Yeah. But I did want to bring up one other thing that's a bit contradictory and a bit of a gotcha bitch moment, which happens multiple times in the film. And this is related to that cheating Irish whore from Portland, which is what Jack Nicholson calls her in your favorite scene. And it goes back to the very first open of the movie when she meets Jack at that dinner party, and she decides to interview him. And he asks her, Jack asks her if she's married or something, and she dodges the question. And then they all night talk about stuff, and she's into this, free love stuff or whatever. And then she ends up moving to New York with him in Greenwich Village and all this stuff. And she's like, oh yeah, do whatever I want. Don't ask questions, whatever. And then when it comes down to it, after she cops to sleeping with the Jack Nicholson character, she asks him he lets it drop that he slept with some other people.
Right.
And she goes, oh, tell me about this. And he goes, what, you want a list? And that was a big gotcha bitch moment, because like, you were just preaching that that's how you want to live. And now you're going to rake him over the coals for this very, very same thing. And, that's another thing of them being contradictory and not having their house in order. She advocated for one thing, but then when it came down to it, she was totally against that when it was applied to her on an individual level.
And it's also setting the rules for other people, but not having to live by them yourself. I mean, let's say, for instance, that Jon Reed and Louise Bryant were the head of the Socialist Party of America, and that party got into power. I mean, do you think that they would be living the lifestyle or living a lifestyle any differently than that they were when they were living in that nice little cottage in New England, while other people were living in cramped quarters in Manhattan or Baltimore or Philadelphia or wherever? No, they would get the most posh situations for themselves and not worry about the downtrodden, how the downtrodden people were living. I know that, like, at the end of the film, Louise has the babushka on her head, and she's acting like a real peasant woman, like a real worker woman. But then, like, if you read her Wikipedia biography, she marries some rich guy and moves to Paris, like after Jon Reed dies, a few years later. So she's not acclimating herself to living a socialist lifestyle in the sense that she has to really, get her fingers dirty and dig in the dirt to make society work. She's looking for the best possible situation she can with the least amount of effort she can.
Like the Bolsheviks when they moved into the Winter Palace, and they're just like,
exactly,
yeah, we'll take this. This is great. Yeah. Why would we go anywhere else? This is
we already got a setup for us. It was already made by the Tsar. So why are we toying with what works?
I think it would have been perfect, a little bit more appropriate at the end of the movie if John had died because he couldn't, it was all socialized medicine, so communist medicine. He couldn't see a doctor or something. He was on a waiting list. That'd have been funnier. But.
Well, I mean, socialized medicine clearly didn't help him.
Didn't.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it was a kidney failure in the movie, but I guess in real life he had typhus.
He had typhus at the end. And ironically, the in the middle of the movie, he had to have his kidney removed. And, the doctor, at one point, the doctor who said to him, he's like, okay, well, what do I owe you? You can just bill me. And the doctor says, well, do you have any money? He says, no. It's like, well, then why would I bill you? Get out of here. And so, like, under the capitalist system, the doctor is telling him, like, you have no money? Well, get out of here. And in the communist system, he dies. Again, he has typhus. Yeah. So you can't really, like, say, well, it was just like a common cold or something. He died of a common cold. But if you're comparing healthcare systems, which one told him to, like, well, you have no money, get the hell out of here, versus, oh, we're going to keep you in a dirty, cramped, windowless hospital, and you're going to die about 2 days later.
Right, and just to put a point on it, he tells him to get out of there after rendering service. Like,
right, exactly.
It's not like, oh, you need your kidney removed, get out of here.
Right.
which is what the progressives want us to think that's how things would
exactly.
go. One other kind of economic point I wanted to make, and this is related to Mises' human action. When he's in jail in Finland and then gets out, and he's with Emma Goldman, he's like sending cables to Bryant and trying to like get a hold of her, and nothing gets answered. He doesn't know this, that she's like traversing the earth trying to get to him. But Emma's response to him is, why doesn't she answer? I think she has answered you.
Right.
But not action is action, right? That's human action, right? Not doing something is a choice, and you're choosing to not do something, and that indicates your preference. So I thought that was a good point to just shoehorn in here for economics angle.
Yes.
Well, here's another economic point, though. At one point, when Jack is kind of complaining about the conditions in Russia, he doesn't blame it on communism. He blames it on all the other countries that surround Russia, and they're like strangling them, right? They're not doing business with them anymore.
Argument now. What we hear about Venezuela now,
Right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, on the one hand, you're offsetting all your problems. You're just like blaming other people. But also, you're recognizing that trade creates wealth, and then you're removing through communism the reason for trade. Like, is there even trade in communism? I don't even know.
But isn't that their whole promise? Is like a communist society is the self-sustaining kind of regime that provides all that the people need. So, what does it matter whether that there are sanctions against Venezuela or Russia or wherever? Like, shouldn't they have the means and the resources to at least sustain themselves until the sanctions are lifted? And why is it like, America wasn't as big as it is now back then. So couldn't they find some kind of backdoor trading partner? Like, China's right there, Mongolia's right there, all these other nations are right there. So how expansive is the American government's reach or the British government's reach, in that they couldn't trade with anybody at that point in order to meet the needs of the people, rather than let however many people it was, 4 million people, I think Emma Goldman says in the movie, starved to death. Why did that happen?
Yep, those nasty embargoes, I guess.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that they would retort with is, well, that's why we need worldwide communism. That's why it's the international, and they need worldwide revolution, because we need to all work collectively together worldwide. There can be no dissent, no wrong think, no individuality. And then it'll work magically. Unicorns and fairy dust.
And yet, even back then, the way they would often answer the socialist price calculation problem was that, the way we'll understand prices, or the way we'll determine prices, is that we'll look at the free market countries and understand what the price should be for bread or for cotton or whatever it is. So even if they wanted global communism, then if they achieve that, then there's no way to understand what the prices should be for consumer goods.
Right. Yeah, they would kill the only information telling
the only metric they have is gone.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It would be I don't know. Like it always amazes me that people who advocate for this top-down control style, progressive socialism, democratic socialism, whatever you want to call it, they're not okay with you living individually or free of them. Like, they won't allow that. Whereas in an ANCAP society that I would advocate for, you're free to have a commune if you want. Go for it. But they can't return the favor.
Well, that's really what my girlfriend is from New England, and I've learned a little bit about the New England states there, because New Hampshire is different from Vermont, and Vermont's different from Maine. And the one thing that she tells me about Vermont is that they really are anti-government from a federal standpoint, or at least traditionally they are. I don't know really about now, but one thing that she said was that they want their own kind of like individual societies, and they're like the communes kind of societies, the townships, and they don't want any interference from government. It's sort of like, yeah, that's the ANCAP vision. We want them to live however they want to live without somebody from San Francisco telling them how they should live. We want them to determine how they should live on their own. And if the people in New Hampshire want to have guns and want to have a free market and everything, they should do that too. And the great thing about ANCAP or anarcho-capitalism is that no matter what your system is in New Hampshire, it doesn't have to impose upon what's going on in Vermont. We can all just live our own lives the way that we want. And if that means communism in Vermont and free laissez-faire capitalism in New Hampshire, why is that a problem? Like, there's no political system that should interfere with either of those systems.
Right. And I'm sure eventually, not too far after that, we would see the contrast between a North and South Korea or an East Germany versus West Germany.
Right. And we would just let people understand, like, look at the examples that are being set in a free society, in a voluntary society, and see what works best.
All right. I have one last comment before we do final summaries and reviews. And you guys feel free to chime in on any last notes you have, because we're going to be a little extra long on this marathon length movie here. But I wanted to bring up the point that the anti-war candidate wins every time as they talk about it in this. Wilson ran anti-war, Teddy Roosevelt ran anti-war, and I think, Robert, you've mentioned this many times, I think almost every candidate who's been the anti-war candidate has been the winner in the presidential elections, and yet most of the time they go back on it a short time later.
Yeah, whenever it's except when it's like a repeat guy, right? Like Obama in his second term, he wasn't running as an anti-war candidate, right? He wasn't running on change.
Well, he didn't have to.
He changed it from change to like hope or whatever it was, or whatever. Yeah. But yeah, whenever there's a new person, they're always, look at this old guy, he's terrible. Vote for me, I'm anti-war. But it doesn't matter. You're always voting for the military-industrial complex in the deep state. So.
Yep.
Yeah, and I did like that they called Teddy Roosevelt a maniac in this, because I heard some Rothbard lectures, and yeah, he literally was a maniac. And Rothbard has great lectures on this era, the progressive era, and a book that just came out, I think last year, that's put together by Patrick Newman, who was able to read Rothbard's handwritten notation related to the book, and so it actually became a book that came out 20 some odd years after Rothbard's death, and it's really good. I have it on my shelf behind me here, and I highly recommend it. I'll put that as a link on our page. Jon Reed, not the communist. Any final notes before we get into winding down here?
Yeah, I think just one last point. At the very end of the film, when Jack is going on the trip with Zinoviev to the Middle East, he's in bad health conditions, and he realizes that somebody has changed his speech, the translation of his speech, to make it a holy war against the capitalists rather than a class war. And he finds out later that Zinoviev changed his speech, and he gets into a very impassioned rant about how when you change, or when you alter, or when you limit free speech, you limit dissent, and when you limit dissent, you limit individuality. And it's really interesting, again, going back to the perception of socialism versus the reality of socialism, in that Jack Reed has this very utopian vision of what socialism is that everybody is going to live as an individual while living in a collective at the same time, and going to be able to express themselves in any way that they can, while he gets a good hard lesson in understanding that the people who are in charge are ultimately going to dictate what's communicated to the people, so that even like the artists in the Soviet Union or the journalists in the Soviet Union are always going to filter down what the people in charge are going to want to communicate. So he's getting a very quick lesson as to what authoritarianism means and why socialism can only lead to authoritarianism. Because if Zinoviev was to not alter speech, if he was to let people just express themselves as they want, then the citizens might understand that individualism rather than collectivism is the way to go, and that would screw up the entire Soviet society. So I think that was a real interesting part of it. And again, like, I think my reason for recommending this film to you guys for this podcast was, I think this is a very good film for libertarians to view and understand and see, like, why their principles are the correct way to go. And it's really illustrated right there in even the utopian socialist vision becomes blatantly like real to even those who aspire to a utopian society. I don't know if I said that very clearly, but there it is.
Yeah, it sounded like you said something, a little word out there.
Those were words. It's late. I'm on the East Coast, man. You're on the West Coast.
All right, Robert, any final notes before we get into the wind down?
No, we covered everything I got, so we can just start up.
All right, well, you're on deck. Go for it, man.
All right. So Jack, to me, as our central character, he struck me as very real character, like we mentioned throughout the show tonight, as this kind of progressive, care hard, kind of more caring and less knowing, very naive, like idealist, right? Like, he's going to go out and he's got these ideas. He's read some books and he's around a bunch of other people that have read the exact same books, and he's going to agitate and he's going to gain control of the ring of power, and he's going to help change the world for the better. Everybody wants to change the world for the better, but few people are so full of hubris and naivete that they think that they can do it through violence and this political process, which is, Jack finds out it's a clusterfuck, but he remains this true believer all the way to the end. He's like a modern day progressive that are just, it's a dogma. It's an ideology. It doesn't really look at the world as it is. They think in terms of the world as which they want it to be, their ideal world. And any problems are a result of these wrong thinkers or the people that just aren't on board this train. And we just need to get them on board with our amazing ideas. And then we can actually have our utopia. It's insanity. It's childlike. And Jack remains that way from the beginning of the movie to the end of the movie. And it's a long, meandering mess. But I will say that, yeah, the inner libertarian nerd in me geeked out the whole time. Ooh, we got to talk about that. Ooh, we got to talk about this. Look at that. Look at that. Property is theft. We got to do this. We got to do that. There's all kinds of great stuff. This is a fantastic movie. I'm glad Jonathan recommended it. I wouldn't necessarily recommend this to like your average normie. I think he's going to get bored. But for political junkies and libertarian people, which is, I assume, the bulk of our audience, absolutely you should be checking this out. I think you'll have a great time. It is long, but it's I would say it's fairly well done, fairly well written. I don't know how much Beatty did to write it, but whatever. Apparently he had a lot of passion for this movie. It does show, although I don't think it necessarily follows like a 3-act structure at all. But and the love story didn't really grab me. It was okay, but I wasn't like cheering for them when they got together finally. And I was sad at the very end when he died, only because I saw the very well acting by the lady, when she obviously cared about him. So that was nice. But overall, I'm going to say that this movie was not a very good movie, but I'm going to give it I'll give it a 6 because of the fantastic discussion that we had talking about it. And I do recommend it.
All right. Thank you for that, Robert. So John, you kind of get the gist of what we're looking for here, a little final summary review and then a score out of 10.
Yeah. I thought the love story actually was good in the sense that they were going for a very non-traditional kind of relationship, and ultimately, like it was very difficult to maintain. So I think that kind of attests to something to traditionalism and the value of traditional values. This is actually one of my favorite movies. When I first saw it, I was a little bored with the format. I recommend if people are going to check this out to watch it once and then watch it again, like give it some space and then watch it again. Especially if you're a libertarian and you're watching it with that filter. I think it holds a lot of value. I think it is a very well done movie. And I say this from somebody who went to film school and is looking at movies in a very cinematic kind of sense. But I give it an 8.5 out of 10. I think this is really well done. I think you don't have to agree with the values that are, and I don't know how much of a communist that Warren Beatty it really is. I sense that he's kind of maybe Marxist sensitive or Marxist friendly, but I don't know how much of a communist he really is. I think that there are a lot of movies that have like principles that you may not agree with, but that are very well done. I'm thinking of like Conspiracy, which is about the meeting that the Nazi party had as far as like coming up with the final solution to the Jewish question. That's a very good movie, even though you don't agree with the principles of the movie. So I think this is a really good movie, and I highly recommend it. I think, again, watch it once, give it a second chance, give it some space, and watch it again and look at it in that filter, that libertarian filter.
All right. Well, thank you for that and the inadvertent dog whistle in there. I've never heard of Conspiracy, but now I'm intrigued. I want to check it out.
Yeah, maybe we'll talk about that next.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, we're not one to shy away from sensitive subjects, and in a funny way, I think we've handled many of them pretty well. I think specifically, Robert, I'm talking about the Easter episode we did with Anarcho-Christian on the Passion of the Christ. I thought we handled that very deftly, and I was quite nervous going into that one because we're both atheists and we're talking to this Christian guy and about a very sensitive movie on Easter, and it worked out pretty well. So anyway, back to Reds. This apparently was one of Ronald Reagan's favorite movies, and he actually had a special screening of it in the White House. I'm not sure what the appeal was, but apparently he knew Warren Beatty from his Hollywood days And it was listed number 9 on the top 10 list of epic films. And I think that's due to the length. I will agree with both of your assessments in various aspects. One is for the Jon Reed Non-Communist. This is a beautifully shot film. The cinematography is great. I think that the structure of the story is a little bit haphazard. Like, I don't understand what the point of the movie is. I did enjoy watching it, but that's because I have my ANCAP lens on and I can I understand what they're talking about and why they're wrong about a lot of it. So it's interesting to watch in that respect. But from a movie telling standpoint, it didn't click for me. And maybe it does warrant a second viewing, but I don't know if I can run that marathon again. But I do appreciate having watched it this one time and having this amazing discussion as a result of it. So thank you for that, John. This is a great recommendation. And I also recommend this film for our audience to do check this out. But I wouldn't necessarily recommend it to just anybody. I think that they do kind of have to have that inoculation against some of the ideas presented here, just so that they can see them and then kind of understand why they don't work.
Right. And there are a lot, again, my favorite scene in the movie where Eugene O'Neill confronts Louise Bryant about when she visits him in an apartment. I think that kind of content appeals very much to libertarian perspective. I think it does take a lot of patience, but I think that libertarians will find a lot of value in this movie.
Yeah, I agree. And so with that, I'll give it a 7 for me. So I'm kind of averaging out between the two of you. Now, Robert.
Yes, sir.
Cue your line regarding next week's episode.
It's that time of the month?
That's right, baby.
Yeah, baby.
It's almost that time of the month. That's right. We'll be back next week with our next installment of the summer series we're doing with Pat McFarlane of Liberty Weekly, where we talk about Star Trek The Next Generation episodes. This next one is a continuation of our last episode where Commander Data was on trial for his life, for his being a sentient being and having self-ownership. Well, we're going to continue that with going down the family tree, if you will, in an episode called The Offspring, where Data creates a quote-unquote child, and then the rights of that child come into question. So that will be the episode that we do next week with Patty McFatty Farley.
You know, I was watching Red Letter Media. They did a recap of all the new comic book stuff coming out of Comic-Con. That's just this past week. And there's a new trailer for Star Trek Picard. And in that trailer, there's this woman, and they're speculating about whether it is like a half woman, half Borg person, or if it's perhaps Data's child. So that might be in the new series, this Data child. So we might be on it. Perfectly appropriate doing this episode right now, Daniel. Imagine that.
Wow.
We almost never do that.
I enjoy being timely on the random occasion that we are. And speaking of timing, that's about all the time we have for this episode of The Last Nighters. So thank you, Jon Reed, for being our guest. And people can find your work at johnreedcreative.com. We will have a link to your information and everything on the show notes page at lastnighters.com/82. You can also find this episode on thelaunchpadmedia.com, where they're always launching new ideas in your direction. And with that, I'll say good night from last night, everybody. All right, and we're going to continue for a few more minutes with the actual Anarchy audience. John, I don't know if you're aware, but we do a show within a show because we're the guys behind the guys. It's a little bit weird that it almost sounds like a gay reference, but it's not.
There's anything wrong with that.
Not that there's anything wrong with that. But this is where we can get a little bit spicier for a few minutes and bring up anything that we forgot to bring up during the Last Nighters portion of the show proper. And one thing I wanted to bring up was the representation of unions in this movie, especially by the Jon Reed character, in that he believes that the unions are one of the instrumental things in promoting the worker revolution, and that the unions are there to help the working man. And in one particular point in the movie, they say that they don't care about what color the person is. If they're skilled or unskilled, it doesn't matter. They're going to help everybody, which is blatantly not true. Like, unions were instituted with the express effort and intent of eliminating certain workers from the working pool, from the labor pool, to raise the wages for the ones who are union members.
Right.
Yeah, go ahead, Robert. You just take off from where I.
Yeah, as I recall, the first unions were that was the very first minimum wage. Is that right? They were trying to prevent these unskilled black laborers from competing with their white laborers, so they wanted to unionize and force them out. Am I getting my stories correctly, or am I mixing them up?
I think you're mixing them, but unions were supportive of minimum wages to that end.
Right.
And licensure.
Right, yeah, licensure, regulations, and all of those things. So it's just interesting to see how it's presented in this movie. And I'm sure Jon Reed believed it. I'm sure, and he actually mentioned when he was talking with the Gene Hackman character that when he says, don't edit my stories anymore.
Right.
And Gene Hackman's like, well, sometimes things need to be changed a little bit. And he's like, but they're the truth or something along those lines.
Right.
And so we're led to believe that he is a true believer, but that his propaganda, his red propaganda, is truth. And it's kind of an interesting discussion these days with what is truth. And I think people have kind of, in present day, really lost what truth is. And you're not going to see it on TV or in your newspaper. I'll pretty much guarantee you that.
And even going back to the unions, even if that wasn't their intention, even if they had really ideal intentions, what other way can it go? Because the whole point of the union is you're organizing the people who are already in the industry, who are already in place and you're by proxy excluding those who aren't in the union. The people who now want to get into an industry now have to fight even harder to get in the industry. And who does that affect? At least, especially back then in the 1920s and 1910s, it's going to affect the low skilled black minority workers, who are just trying to make a better living for themselves in America. So it's, even if it's not the intended purpose, there are unintended consequences as a result that are very racist by economic terms.
Right, and this reminds me of sorry, Robert, just one anecdote related to the film. Apparently, Warren Beatty wanted a specific crew working a set in Italy, I want to say. Like, he had brought his crew with him from England. I guess principal photography was in London or something. And because of the laws in Italy at the time, and they may still be in place, but you had to use Italian union workers for the crew. And so they had the Italian crew on set doing nothing but getting paid full rate while they had their crew doing the work. And this was all because of the regulations and rules around shooting a film there. So, sorry, one more anecdote. Just throw that in.
Well, I mean, that goes on today. I mean, I think that they're trying to change the tax situation now in LA, but for the past 20 years, there have been so many production companies who have flown to Georgia or flown to Canada to shoot films rather than staying in LA. Breaking Bad was supposed to be shot in LA, but they shot it in Albuquerque because of the tax situation. And it's, all these people in Hollywood who exude progressive values and talk about, the virtues of taxation and paying more and paying your fair share and everything. Once it affects them personally, they head for the hills. They're always looking for the place where they can pay the least amount of taxes in order to get their production at budget or under budget. So it's really interesting to understand the dynamic. Again, going back to Bernie Sanders and his minimum wage, his $15 an hour wage that he now has to pay his workers for fewer hours. So it's all about, like, once you ignore the laws of economics for so long, they're going to catch up to you and they're going to punch you in the face once you actually have to put them into practice, whether it's owning a business or running a campaign or what have you.
Yeah, and one more ironical thing, irony. The whole reason that Hollywood's even a thing is because there were people trying to make films, and a certain way of looping the film and the camera was patented. And because patents could only be enforced within a certain, distance from the East Coast, they went all the way to the West Coast to get around that.
Yeah, I mean, for that kind of law and for many other laws, they went to the West Coast where the federal government couldn't really touch them until California became a state.
And now California is so ridiculous that you see movie studios going to Vancouver, to Georgia, all over. And then not only that, but then Californians themselves are just fleeing like rats from a sinking ship.
Oh, yeah. The thing about in Berkeley now, the city council, I guess, voted on you can't say manhole, and you can't say you can't say specific genders in public spaces, and I don't even remember, like public signs maybe. Like they're changing all the words on all the things because somebody might get offended when you're
the Ministry of Truth is important, Daniel. We need to know what to call things. Someone could get offended.
Jane, get me off this crazy thing.
Apparently all the problems are solved in Berkeley, that they have time for this.
Yeah, it really
is.
Think
Berkeley would just be some utopia, right? I mean,
Yeah,
if all these things are working as intended.
They do have a great burrito place on the main drag there. I went there once.
They've grown so much from the time that Kamala Harris was mocked for being black or being a mixed race by the residents of Berkeley there.
Yeah, file that under things that didn't happen.
Exactly.
Anyway, there was something else funny I was going to say, but we should probably end the show here and get into our Kathleen Turner Overdrive, which I don't know how long we'll have you around for, John, but it is a bonus for our Patreon peeps to have a little bit of post-show stuff where we hang even looser than we do on the actual Anarchy portion of the show.
This is as loose as I get.
All right. Well, it'll be Robert and I getting loose when we get into Kathleen Turner Overdrive, available for Patreon supporters at actualanarchy.com/Patreon. This has been episode 139 of the show. You can catch John's previous appearance talking about the Aviator at actualanarchy.com/33. And any final words for our audience, Mr. Non-Communist Jon Reed?
Yeah, this is a real pleasure. It's we should do this more often. It was fun the first time. It was fun this time, and I really appreciate you having me on. It was great.
Indeed, we really appreciate you. You brought a lot to this, and a great recommendation on the film. Robert, close us out.
Yeah, baby. Maximum freedom. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Thanks you for supporting the show, leaving a like on the video, telling your friends and family about us, writing a review in the old iTunes or whatever it's called these days, and just getting the word out there. So thank you for that. And thank you for listening. You people are awesome.
Maximum freedom, everybody.
The Chipmunks. CHIPMUNK. We're the Chipmunks. Guaranteed to brighten your day. Do 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 do.
In the early days of the internet, radical libertarians were scattered, lonely, and faceless. Without direction, they resigned to scour the web, sifting through content providers in a wasteland plagued by YouTube demonetization, Facebook jail, and covert internet censorship. But then, in 2017, the Libertarian Union was formed. Finally, the average Joe libertarian could find a thriving community of independent podcasters and content providers, all in one convenient location. At Libertarian Union, we'll always have the latest news, interviews, discussions, and even movie reviews. With hundreds of episodes and more added all the time, you'll always find something fresh at libertarianunion.com.